The psychology of violence is an underrated topic. As a therapist, I definitely believe that talk is more than just talk. And the way we think about things and the way we talk about them can directly contribute to the way those events actually unfold in life. And while that's true in cognitive behavioral therapy, it's also true on a global scale where the way the mainstream media covers global conflicts, I'm putting that word in quotes, can directly impact the way the world sees those conflicts, which can actually then go on to shape world events. So, the obvious example here would be that the mainstream Western media has manufactured consent for the Zionist genocide in Palestine by continuing to use the same terminology that the war criminals used to refer to that genocide, that, you know, a long list of international human rights organizations have referred to as a genocide, and that the International Criminal Court has likewise ruled on. Uh, Yet the mainstream Western media, Western politicians, because it's their genocide, they have a vested interest in allowing that genocide to persist for political gain. They use the same terminology as the war criminals used to describe that genocide, which is the quote Israel Hamas conflict. So the reason I'd like to explore the psychology of violence today, well, the specific example I'd like to unpack is one where you have three categories of people: an oppressor, an oppressed, and someone who does not have anything to do with the violence or does not feel they have anything to do with the violence, at least. And we're going to call this third category of person a peaceful or privileged person, because on the surface, they might actually seem like the enlightened one. There are two people fighting, there are two groups who are engaged in combat. And those two groups, from the perspective of the so called peaceful person, might seem like they're both in the wrong. Now, after a year of live streamed genocide, thankfully, if nothing else, we can at least say that the world has come to wake up to the extent of Israel's atrocities. Before 2023, it used to be pretty much like a sin to talk about Israel at all. Anytime anyone opened their mouth against Israel, the ADL would be quick to rush in and call them anti Semitic, and that would be that. There would be no more further conversation of the human atrocities being committed. A lot of the atrocities we see today were committed for the past 76 years, since the original Nakba, the original colonization of Palestine by the British. So the picture of the oppressor, the oppressed, and the peaceful party, when the peaceful party looks at that picture, they used to not see any oppression or any violence at all because of that climate where it was just this black cloud. No one was allowed to look at it or discuss it at all. Over the past year of genocide, that's no longer become an option. The Palestinians, through their resistance and resilience, have forced the world to talk about their own oppression that they have suffered for the past century. So now that we're allowed to talk about it, how do we, and when I say we, I mean people who are living under the third category of people, who are the so called peaceful party, the privileged party, where we are not directly engaged in the combat, how do we make sense of the picture of the oppressor and the oppressed? We look over at a picture of violence. We are not the ones living in the violence. We do not actively fear for our lives on a daily basis, alhamdulillah. We are living in a relatively peaceful place. We're not in a war zone, but we're seeing it on the other side of the world, across an ocean. A lot of people in the peaceful party, even though they now are capable of recognizing that there is violence that's happening, they are not yet capable of discerning oppressor from oppressed. To them, because they live peacefully, they almost have a superiority, a sense of superiority about it, that they did nothing to earn. And this is what gets to me, that they act like they're enlightened and they look down on people who are fighting for their lives, and they feel comfortable to comment, to pass judgment on them. This is why I always like to say that pacifism is a very privileged worldview. You don't have the option of not using violence in self-defense if you are oppressed because you have something to defend against. You are constantly being attacked. So it's very easy for someone who's never been attacked to say you must always be peaceful. If you're being attacked, you're going to quickly find out that that worldview falls apart pretty swiftly. Um, and this, of course, might depend on how some people define pacifism. But essentially, looking at that picture of the oppressor and the oppressed, some people who are living in the peaceful conditions, looking at that picture, struggle to differentiate between the two parties. They don't realize that all violence is not equal. There is an offender and a defender, and they are willing to listen to the way the offender twists the narrative to make themselves seem like the defender. And then pretty soon it starts to look to the peaceful onlooker like two immature or barbaric or unenlightened groups of people who are like swatting their hands at each other. Basically, really an image of an uncivilized and equally immature almost groups of people who are just fighting back and forth, and oh, shame on humanity that they can't learn to be peaceful. And this is the rhetoric that I really feel comes from a position of extreme privilege and extreme ignorance. That I hear a lot, honestly, that people who really are so privileged to not be oppressed and not be under attack and not face genocide can look at a picture of two parties engaged in combat, and even if one group is fighting for their lives, like what are Palestinians fighting for? Existence, not hypothetical right to exist, actual existence. They are being wiped out. Thousands of families wiped off the registry. So they are fighting for the right to exist on the land they are indigenous to. And daily there are massacres in the most vicious ways committed by the Zionists against the people of Palestine. Meanwhile, what are the people of Israel fighting for? They are fighting for domination. They are fighting to keep the land that they stole. They are fighting for colonization. And the whole Zionist project, the very artificially constructed house of cards, is really starting to shake and tremble and fall apart. And this picture is very clear to anyone who's acquainted with it without bias, anyone who's just concerned with, human rights. But it might not be clear to someone who doesn't understand the psychology of violence and is quick to dismiss violence altogether.
Why won't your organization engage in peace talks with the Israelis?
You don't mean exactly peace talks, you mean capitulation, surrendering.
Why not just talk?
Talk to whom?
Talk to the Israeli leaders.
That's kind of conversation between the sword and the neck, you mean?
Well, if there were no swords and no guns in the room, you could still talk.
No, I had never seen any talk between a colonialist case and a national liberation movement.
But despite this, why not talk?
Talk about what?
Talk about the possibility of not fighting.
Not fighting for what?
Not fighting at all, no matter what for.
Yeah, people usually fight for something and they stop fighting for something. So you can't tell me even why should we speak about what?
Well, stop fighting.
For what? Or talk about stop fighting why?
Talk to stop fighting, to stop the death and the misery, the destruction, the pain.
The misery and the destruction and the pain and the death of whom?
Of Palestinians, of Israelis, of Arabs.
Of the Palestinian people who are uprooted, thrown in the camps, living in starvation, killed for 20 years, and forbidden to use even the name Palestinians.
They're better that way than dead, though.
Maybe to you, but to us, it's not. To us, to liberate our country, to have dignity, to have respect, to have our mere human rights is something as essential as life itself.
And this is the sad part, where the moment an oppressed population dares to fight back, they are disqualified from earning the sympathy of the peaceful party. Basically, they have to sit there and take it. They have to be disempowered. They have to suffer, and they're not allowed to stand up, and they're not allowed to fight for their people, lest the peaceful party deem them as bad as their enemies and say, oh, you guys are just fighting, you're just engaged in this messy combat, and you should become enlightened and peaceful like the rest of the world. And this is really a big issue when it comes to colonized countries in general. Colonized countries have generally pretty horrible governments, puppet governments of tyrants who have been put in place not to represent the interests of the people, but to represent the interests of the empire, the larger Western empire. And so it's not a coincidence that a lot of colonized countries, even though people use the word post colonial, our world is still a colonized world. It's not a coincidence that a lot of those countries are struggling economically and they don't have their own, cultures built up, that they are really living under the oppressive thumb of the Western Empire. Yet, the Western population who has not been colonized um, doesn't realize this and looks down on them and says, look at your violent countries, look at your crazy practices. You don't have freedom of speech. We have freedom of speech. Aren't we amazing? And again, it's frustrating to listen to, because the only reason they don't have freedom of speech is because the Western Empire, whose privileges you enjoy living under as the colonizer party, has made sure of it, has made sure that, like, for example, Saudi Arabia, people get imprisoned. Muslim scholars get imprisoned when they dare to criticize the state. Um, the Saudi Arabian state, which is compliant with the United States. So there's just so much. Essentially, I just feel a big sense of frustration when I hear people comment in a way where they feel themselves enlightened despite having done nothing to earn the ease they have been blessed with. And the people they're looking down on are victims of their own empire's oppression and atrocity. SubhanAllah, I've been reading Surat al-Anfal lately, and I think maybe a lot of Muslims can relate to this, where this isn't a chapter in the Quran that's about war. And the way I used to read it, it didn't feel particularly applicable to my life before. And I would try to apply it, and mostly I would think, yeah, these are the chapters that are, this is, these verses are meant for the people who actually lived through times of war. And it doesn't mean as much to me, and I'm just going to apply it to my life in like a metaphorical way. And subhanallah, Allah knew better, Allah knows best, that it ended up being one of the chapters of the Quran that had the most remarkably direct relevance to our daily lives now, with the genocide going on in Palestine. Now, the image of the three groups, oppressor, oppressed, and bystander, peaceful, privileged spectator character, also applies on a local scale to the family system, where sometimes when there's an abusive person in a family and they keep abusing, even if only emotionally, uh, another person in the family, we'll call them the survivor of that abuse, then there's someone else who's not part of this, someone else in the family who's kind of witnessing the abuse from afar, or they're witnessing this constant bickering, right? Like the person who is on the receiving end of the abuse, let's say one day they have enough, they snap, they start fighting back, and it gets very ugly because the narcissistic abuser is enraged that someone has dared to put them in their place, dared to stand up to their local level tyranny. And now, if you're an onlooker, a spectator person who isn't directly involved in this argument, all you're seeing is two people bickering. Oh, look at these two people both raising their voices, these two groups of people. Um, it's like the person watching gets to retain their dignity because they are uninvolved, and they get a sense of moral high ground out of that. They're judging these two people and failing to differentiate between them. So it's like there's this belief that uh, the pure thing is to be uninvolved and the lowly thing is to fight. And it is such an unfair equating of the oppressor with the oppressed at any level. I had this thought recently because we were rallying on the streets and we received some racist death threats from a passerby, and we were kind of yelling. He was yelling. We were yelling to stop the genocide. He was yelling death threats at us. But to a passerby, it might have just looked like two groups of people yelling, just, oh, who are these annoying people yelling who are disturbing the peace of our peaceful society? So again, it always comes back to that. Is right and wrong based on being quiet versus being rowdy? Or is right and wrong based on someone who is aggressing on other people's rights versus someone who is retaining those rights, who is just trying to protect their own rights and not let other people step on them? And so for me, obviously, it's the latter. But often in society, we talk about it like it's the former. Like the moment someone stands up to their abuser, the moment someone refuses to take bullying at school, it's like both kids get in trouble with the principal. I don't care who started it. I'm going to end it. All those really toxic phrases we say, why doesn't it matter who started it? If someone is the defender and someone is the offender, that should matter, right? But no, just violence in general was bad. Okay, well, what do you do? What if you were the one who was in the situation where someone was violent toward you? What are you expected to do? Take it until you die? Because that's the way society talks. And that's the way the privileged talk when they have not personally been exposed to violence. Now, let me throw one last wrench into this picture of the oppressor, the oppressed, and the peaceful or privileged party. There aren't actually three groups on this map. There are two. And what I mean by that is the peaceful party actually hails from the society of the oppressor. Their tax dollars directly contribute to funding the oppression of the oppressed. So, even worse than being uninvolved, when the peaceful party looks down on those who need to use violence to survive, they are actually blaming their own victims because the peaceful party is not uninvolved. The peaceful party's wealth is funding the oppression of the oppressed party. So, as much as people like to act as though their hands are clean and they have nothing to do with the violence they see on their screens, they are directly involved. Your government has directly involved you if you live in a Western land. Even if you live in the Middle East, your government has directly involved you because Middle Eastern governments are also Zionist. The Western Empire has made sure of that. So if you are not actively fighting this genocide and you are directly involved, you are one of those groups of people I just mentioned, please join the fight. This is your fight. You are expected to join it. If you are Muslim, know that Allah is calling you to fight oppression, that our silence allows for this genocide to persist. And some people say, what's the point? Some people say that, we can go out and have our little rallies and no one is going to pay attention. And that's a very comfortable worldview to have. It's very nice and easy to conclude that nothing can be done, so let's do nothing. Let's not even try to do anything. If everyone who opposed the genocide, which is most people on the planet, were to voice their opposition to the genocide on a regular basis, then the war criminals would realize that their actions have consequences. They would actually see in real time the consequences to those actions, and that would make them think twice about how much they think they can get away with. So don't be a spectator to this life that you are actively participating in. We are not enlightened just because we are not part of the violence. On the contrary, if we are not part of the violence, that's because we are insanely privileged and we are required by Allah to use that privilege that he has entrusted us with to test us, to see what we are going to do with it. Jazakumullah khair. Salam.